that today we have invited our guest speaker, namely Dr. Philip Hultquist from New Mexico. Let me introduce him. Dr. Philip teaches for the Global and National Security Policy Institute and the Department of Political Science at the University of New Mexico. He's research fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point and a fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. Previously, Philip taught politics, policy, and strategy for the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies and served as the interim director of the Good Pastor Scholars, the U.S. Army Practitioner PhD program. Before joining SAMS, Dr. Hultquist taught for several years at Roosevelt University, where he served as the director of the International Studies program. Dr. Philip researched international relations, deterrence, and strategy with a regional focus on India. His prior research has covered irregular warfare, state targeting and repression in counterinsurgencies, peace settlements in civil wars, state and social politics of hydroelectric dams in India, and countering violent extremism in the Khalistan insurgency in India. His research has appeared in World Development Journal of Peace Research, Political Science and Politics, Conflict Management, and Peace Science, the Journal of Punjab Studies, Special Operational Journals, and Military Review. His current book project, tentatively titled as The India Gamble, evaluates theories of India's foreign policy behavior to draw implication for U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So today he would talk about the importance of India as far as the Indo-Pacific region is concerned. So Dr. Philip, please, very welcome to you from Karachi. Very welcome, and hope that our students will also enjoy, and you will infuse them with a very good knowledge of your area of expertise. Please, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Khan. I really appreciate that introduction. It's very kind. I just got to say I'm very happy to be invited and happy to speak to you all today. I hope that, I hope that this is somewhat interesting for you. I have to tell you that it's a work in progress. I don't have it all complete yet, but it is part of a larger book project on, as Dr. Khan said, on the sort of the role of India and U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. And you'll see a little bit why I think that focusing on India makes some good sense here, and why U.S. policy needs to sort of evaluate this critically. Okay, so that was a great introduction. My title here is a little bit broader than what I'm going to talk about, but I think that'll show you. And I'm going to kind of I'm going to zoom in a little bit on a certain question on sort of India's alignment behavior. Then I'm going to zoom back out to sort of the geostrategic relations and some of the issues that that will entail. Okay, so to get us started. Basically, I want to kind of frame this up as the way that U.S. policy is thinking about India and the Indo-Pacific. So U.S.-India relationships have been pretty rocky for many decades, and then sort of slowly in the 2000s, really kicking off in 2005, but maybe even a little bit before that, they started getting a little warmer and a little warmer, and now over the last few years, the U.S. policy has really put a big emphasis on the role India is going to play in the Indo-Pacific, along with other countries. And you can read the unclassified strategy documents that kind of tell us what those things are going to be, or what they expect them to be. Certain net security provider for the neighborhood wants to help India better control the Indian Ocean, sort of things like that. But in general, the sort of big way to think about it is India being a big, large country, and China being what the U.S. sees as the major challenge. India can provide sort of a counterbalance to that. So that's sort of the way that U.S. policy typically thinks about India and its current strategy. This raises 5 dilemmas that the book is going to cover. I'm only going to focus on one of them here today, but in general, there's a dilemma between both countries' domestic politics. Whenever either side gets into the other one a little bit, things get a little bit they get a little bit hairy. They get a little bit difficult to manage, right? So a lot of folks in the United States don't like the rise of Hindu nationalism. or some of the human rights issues that happen in India. India really doesn't like it when the U.S. domestic political system, or maybe somebody in Congress, brings that kind of stuff up. So they always have these rows that happen back and forth. So that's one dilemma. Another one is, should the U.S. support India's regional hegemonic ambitions or not? It says it wants India to be a net security provider, but with China increasing its influence in South Asia, particularly in the Himalayas and Sri Lanka, some of these other places, it has sort of challenged India's position, or sort of presumed position as a aspiring regional hegemon, because the U.S. wants India to focus on the Indian Ocean. There's a real geopolitical shift that's kind of a dilemma. Can India really shift from being a continental power to a maritime focus, given that it's got two major land dispute, both of its major territorial partner or territorial countries are adversaries with territorial disputes, with being Pakistan and China. Should the U.S. support arms indigenization in India? Normally, the U.S. likes to just transfer arms, sometimes more so than building up the indigenous capacity inside that country. Although this is the main thing that India wants. And so the question we're really going to focus on today is, will India align to a degree that U.S. policymakers expect? So you'll see as we come forward that U.S. policymakers tend to have an unspoken, sort of expectation about what goes along with the investments that it makes in a country. So U.S. strategy is betting on India aligning with the United States. It's increased security cooperation, technology transfers, really to a quite high degree. They're talking about co-development of defense technologies. Again, this is all stuff that India wants. The U.S. has been a little bit hesitant to give, but is kind of coming around to. The U.S. has some unspoken expectations, again, of the security cooperation. In general, without saying it out loud, my view is that U.S. policymakers tend to view these investments in security cooperation as sort of a first step toward a greater relationship, and that greater relationship is typically moving toward, some form of alliance. The U.S. thinks about things in terms of alliances, not just, which is very different than, of course, the way people in India think about it, and lots of other countries as well. And the U.S. also tends to expect that when you align with the U.S. in general, when you get this security cooperation, that you should de-align or disalign yourself with U.S. adversaries. It's sort of an unspoken thing. So what I'm worried about is that the U.S.-India relationship, which has a lot of positives to it, will create this expectations gap. That we might not be talking that, not literally speaking the same language, but basically that we're talking about two different things when we're talking about security cooperation. And these expectations have a basis in U.S. strategic paradigms, right? U.S. strategic culture, U.S. strategic thinking, that in particular realism, expects India would want to balance with the United States against China. So it sort of should be a natural ally. And liberals expect that democracies are supposed to be natural allies, despite all of the history from the Cold War. So the U.S. is expecting this alignment, but as you know, right, if anybody is paying attention to Indian foreign policy over a long time, India's foreign policy is famously non-aligned. They don't call it non-alignment anymore, but there's a lot of, but there's still a high preference for strategic autonomy, you might say. So that kind of creates this question: Is India's foreign policy past? Is India's foreign policy past, driven by strategic culture? Is it driven by this sort of internal preference for autonomy, or is it driven by external conditions? And so this is really what we're trying to do. We're trying to, the basic point here is that when you make a policy and a strategy, you have to take into account how all the other actors are going to respond to that policy, and your strategy has to deal with that. We know that international outcomes are not based on one person's or one side's preferences. They interact, and the outcomes are sometimes difficult to foresee. So what you really want to do is validate a model of everybody else's behavior in your strategy. And typically when people do this, they focus on the adversary countries, but I think that you need to focus this on friendly countries as well. If you're gonna bet on a country that's even friendly to you, or that you want to be more friendly with, you still have to sort of validate your model of their behavior. What happens a lot is what I would call poor strategy, in the sense that we don't really always validate those models. We don't talk about them out loud. Instead, we rely on our gut reactions, our assumptions, stereotypes, and often wishful thinking. We assume that, okay, if we do this, that it's obvious that somebody else will do something else. And so sometimes those are unexamined, or at least they're not stated out loud. So that's kind of the goal here, right? We've got this big policy question about the India gamble, and then we've got this academic question that's built into it. So we can look in and evaluate the model of Indian foreign policy behavior, validate it with some history, and see if that gives us a better basis for policy than sort of our gut reactions or our implicit strategic thinking in terms of realism or liberalism. Okay, so the models of foreign policy that I'm gonna, that I think are important, and so for the book is going to look at these two kind of big broad categories: the ideational models. And ideational means it's sort of these are ideas in someone's head, as opposed to sort of material or some reality on the ground. It might be about perceived reality as opposed to an objective reality. And the two main ideational models are strategic culture. This is sort of a country or society's sort of way of thinking about strategy or strategic questions in general. Sometimes people focus on leaders' personality or psychology. We focus a lot on, if you're watching the news, it's Modi is doing this, or Putin is doing that, or Biden is doing this, and they usually draw it back to some individual level characteristic about that person's personality or their psychology. But those are all about ideas in someone's head. Context-based models, on the other hand, are more deductive. They sort of take from a general assumptions and then sort of work their way down to what we'd expect behavior to be. And in general, they would expect countries or states to be rational and to sort of, or individuals to be rational, and then they respond to their context. So you can respond to your geopolitical context, like international structure. This is a very realist point of view. We're going to see the one I'm going to use is kind of a realist balance of threat, which is a little bit different than balance of power theory, but basically focusing more on threatening behaviors as opposed to just material power. And then, of course, you can have a domestic politics context where a party in power, maybe an individual in power, they're worried about their domestic political survival, and that can affect their foreign policy. I'm going to leave that one out for today, mostly for time, and because I haven't finished some of the analysis for the book yet. But the main point here is that models must be validated or disconfirmed on past behavior. You don't want to just sort of assume them and move forward. You want to validate them. You want to look back at the past, and that's what we're gonna do today. Okay, we'll start with India's strategic culture. So there's a big debate about Indian strategic culture, and almost all the debates start around: does India have a strategic culture? There's a handful of books in the early 90s that wrote that India doesn't have a strategic culture. And what they meant by that is it doesn't have a culture of thinking strategically. My point of view is that, yes, it does have a strategic culture. Not only does it have a culture of thinking strategically, but even if you didn't, the assumptions and everything you brought along to your strategy would reflect a culture of that. And so even if you didn't have a stated strategic culture or a culture of thinking strategically, that would sort of be your strategic culture. And to look at a couple of ways that people use strategic culture in India, a very common way to do this is working off Ian Johnson's work on strategic culture. He did one on, it's called Cultural Realism. It was a strategic culture of China. He looked at the 7 military classics of China and then drew out implications for what if China's behavior followed some sort of ancient strategic culture. People do this in India using Kautilya or Chanakya, in the Mandala Raj system. I don't find it particularly compelling most of the time because they sort of take this mandala system and then they map it onto the map that looks like now. But the reason the map looks the way it does is because of historical contingency, not really, based on the mandala system. And then, of course, India doesn't necessarily always change as the map changes. So that's one way that's used. Another way that it's been used, I think, more fruitfully is from Kanti Bajpai, who's mapped out different strategic perspectives, and looking at India's strategic culture. There's sort of a hyper-realist view, and there's a Gandhian view, and a neoliberal view. So he kind of maps that out and talks about how that maps onto Indian elite culture, and I think that's pretty fruitful. And then the two kind of outputs of this, most that people focus on when I think of India's strategic culture, is one is strategic restraint. I think the most explicit version of this was from Stephen Cohen and Sunil Dasgupta in their book Arming Without Aiming. They have a chapter on India's strategic culture as being one of restraint. It doesn't push the boundaries. It's always kind of going back to the status quo. Sumit Ganguly and I'm forgetting his name, Kapoor, have a good counter to that in the National Interest a few years ago, talking about how India doesn't necessarily restrain itself under all circumstances. It sort of depends whether it's got a status quo preference or not. And the one that we care about for today is a sort of look at strategic autonomy as the core of Indian strategic culture. If they want to protect their own autonomy, and they've done this through non-alignment or possibly through other means. So we're going to look a little bit at non-alignment and what that looks like in India. This is probably not news to most of you if you're studying regional politics and history and international relations with Dr. Khan, but I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights. Non-alignment in India is not nearly just as passive as it sounds. It's not simply refusing to align. It was a positive vision for a different way of doing international politics, an alternative to great power politics, which Nehru in particular and some of the other leads saw as imperialistic. Great power politics were imperial, and they were dangerous to international security. And, that these great powers were going to hold the world hostage. We're going to hold the world hostage through nuclear terror. They eventually built the non-aligned movement with several other countries. It's sort of built on some of the 5 pillars, the Panchsheel agreement. Right, this is respect for boundaries. It's respect for each other, peaceful coexistence, things like that. And I'm going to keep muting people when I do that. I hope that doesn't bother you. And all of this really protects Indian autonomy, right? Which really has which has a much earlier manifestation in concepts like Swaraj from Gandhi and other things for self-rule, and comes from the Indian independence movement. And it was seen to this sort of a path to international peace, right? So it's different than just simply non-aligning. We'll talk a little bit about how that comes in conflict with some other things. But as I said, this is part of a bigger part of Indian culture and strategic culture, really coming out of the independence movement, thinking for not just geopolitical non-alignment and geopolitical self-rule, but also self-sufficiency, which was seen as a way of getting to that self-rule, right? And it looked different depending on who you were asking, right? Gandhi famously made his own clothes, so he wouldn't have to buy British clothes, and that was a type of self-sufficiency. Nehru, right, we talked about the non-aligned movement, but he also saw an industrialization project as sort of being the baseline for having self-rule. And we see this not just from Nehru, but into the current period, where you've got Make in India campaign, you've got the Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-sufficient India. So it's economic policies on top of geopolitical preferences for staying out of blocks. So there's what I'm trying to say is, from the strategic culture point of view, this is a deeper preference than just your feelings about great power blocks, or just their feelings about the United States or the Soviet Union or anything else. Strategic culture approach has got some strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths is that it tries specifically to take into account the country-specific context. It's not pretending that all countries act the same, or they have the same universal rationalist motivations. The weaknesses, however, are basically the flip side of that, right? So sometimes the culture gets reduced to simplicities. It's not really clear how these cultures emerge and how they translate into into international politics? Should we focus on the society's culture? So I've read people that say, well, we should look into Confucianism to understand China, or we should look into Hinduism to understand India. Or maybe you should just look at the elite culture, which might be different than the society at large. It's more urban based, it's more educated. It might be different. So we don't actually know where to look. And the most important thing from my point of view is it suffers from the fundamental attribution error, which might be a new word to you or a new term. It's a finding in psychology that says that individuals tend to ascribe their own behavior, especially when it's bad behavior. They say, oh, well, it's because of this context. It's because of this circumstance that I had to do this bad thing. But when somebody else does something bad, we ascribe it to their character. So it's a psychological fallacy that we do this. And it happens, I think, a lot in strategic culture. We don't look inward on ourselves and think about, or when we look inward on ourselves, we think about the context. And when we look outward, we think, oh, they're just bad actors. There's just something wrong with these people, with this culture, with something. And so that can be a real problem. As opposed to the geopolitical response model, has some of the flip side strengths and weaknesses. The one I'm going to use here is partly based on a realist balance of threat theory, which comes from Stephen Walt in the late 80s and his work on alliances. And the basic idea here is it's not just material power. Countries don't just try to balance out on power like neorealism expects, but really they care about the threat, right? What they can ascribe to that country and how threatening they think it is based on its behavior, based on its character, based on some of its domestic politics. So it's a little bit more, it accounts for more than just the power. The basic idea here is that in the absence of great power status, if you don't have self-sufficiency and security, India or anybody else will align based on great power and adversary alignments. They have to respond to this great power balancing game, regardless of your strategic culture. So even if your strategic culture says, I'm not going to play that game, you might still have to play it. And that could be proactive by preventing two states you don't want to align from aligning. And that could be reactive to balance against adversary states, once they have aligned. This model, I can do this a little bit quicker because it's kind of the flip side, of the strategic culture. Its strengths are it's a little bit more deductive. It's parsimonious. You don't have to learn the particulars of every country. It's easier to measure and test. The mechanisms are a little bit clearer. However, it doesn't account for the particulars of a country's character, and so it makes it difficult to. Sometimes that makes it difficult to square with our reality. Not all countries are going to act the same in the same scenario, because they're going to deal with it in different ways, or they're going to perceive it in different ways. Okay, so starting to get into the research a little bit better. The alignment in international relations is really a behavioral concept. So you don't have to read this necessarily, but it's based on a variety of behavioral actions. It's not based on rhetoric, and it's not based on just sort of happy feelings. You need to behave in some way to align. And so I use Michael Ward's definition here, but I'm going to add two additions. One is that what I really care about is its relationship to great power blocks, and that will become clear when I show up later here. And it's a relational approach. It's sort of how much do you align with one or the other, but it does not assume a zero-sum approach. So in my approach, you could become closer to the US and the Soviet Union at the same time, theoretically, even if in reality that didn't happen very often in the Cold War. And you'll see why here with my alignment concept. So I'm trying to take this concept of alignment and create a little bit more nuance. So the way that we typically think about it is sort of a continuum. You've got non-alignment over here, and you've got full alignment and alliance over here, and you're just moving along it. That's sort of the way the U.S. typically thinks about it. But I tried to develop a different way of thinking about it. So it gives me 4 different categories. So one is on the left-hand side here is to what degree are your relationships with the other great powers exclusive, or are they non-exclusive? Meaning that you're willing to have strong relationships with, or you're willing to have relationships with multiple great power blocks, or are you just going to choose one? And then on the upper side, the depth of cooperation, sort of how much cooperation are we talking about? So this gives us 4 categories, right? If you have a lot of, right, so if you're not very exclusive and you have little cooperation with almost anyone, you're really insular. That's kind of a version of non-alignment. And you can move to more exclusive, but still low cooperation. That would be shallow alignment. You can have a lot of a very exclusive and a lot of cooperation. That's deep alignment. And then the bottom right corner is where you're not very exclusive, but you have a deep cooperation with multiple great power blocks. So it's multi-alignment. So this gives us a few different categories that we can use to map India's relationship on. I'm going to keep this a little bit shorter for the interest of time here, but the basic idea here is over time, I'm going to look at some different measures of alignment. Right now, I've got defense, arms imports is sort of my major measurement of alignment. And there's good reasons for that, but it's also imperfect. It won't solve all of our problems. It doesn't tell us all about the political or economic alignment. And then the paper uses kind of a narrative analysis to break India's foreign affairs history into different sections, into different periods, and codes them along this different type of alignment. So you can see here a mapping of what I see as India's change over time in alignment. So for one, yes, it has a culture of strategic autonomy, and this was strongest in the early period, but you will see changes over time in its alignment based on the geopolitical conditions. I've noted here the parties that are in power in these different fields. These periods don't line up with, when the periods line up with their alignment story, and they don't line up with political parties. Right? You can see, for one, you can see the INC is in all of these. You can see the BJP is in 2 of them. Right? So that what I'm trying to show here is that there's a little bit more nuance than just the political relationship, or at least this doesn't line up clearly. There's also only about 4 or 5 major movements here over India's independent history. So these are slow-moving processes. And I'm using these categories. You know, these are not always clean breaks. But you'll see, you can probably tell by the number of years that I'm using, there's a reason for those years based on Indian history. Okay. So I'm seeing some chat here. Oh, okay, good. Okay, back to this. Okay, so our first period, this is non-alignment from 1947 to 1962. This is a lot of what we already talked about in terms of the origins of India's non-aligned movement. This is when Nehru really had really strong control over India's foreign policy, and a lot of Nehru's ideas get built in pretty heavily into India's foreign policy. And so we expect this period to be the most non-aligned that you can be, right? India kind of took age from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. was trying to court both Pakistan and India at the same time, and it didn't quite work out. And so when as it starts to get closer to Pakistan, India starts to bristle a little bit at that. This is also a period where you start to see an increased friendship between Pakistan and China. The USSR and the People's Republic of China, after the revolution in '49, they are very tight for at least this early period, and they start to kind of frazzle over time. This period also showed major shifts in Indian position on China. So Nehru was originally pretty happy with China. They thought they were going to get along. They were both going to work to help some of the third world, and they would be partners in this non-aligned movement, or maybe not the movement itself, but in this sort of a break from the great power blocks. But the Chinese annexation of Tibet really changed that. And that put China right on the border. It kind of ended some of the buffer state that Tibet had been. And of course, that gave a lot of the territorial disputes between India and China that are still going on. The 1961 annexation of Goa was a big event that hurt U.S.-India relationship. So India really, or U.S. Was really against that. They spoke out at the United Nations. They tried to stop India from annexing Goa. Portugal was a NATO ally, so this was put the U.S. in a tough spot, and they chose, anyway, the U.S. chose Portugal, and the Soviet Union was much more supportive of India in that process. And of course, the 1962 China-India War is really kind of the big break in this in this period. It was at that point that it became clear that Nehru's vision of kind of focusing on industrialization, you could kind of stay aloof and be non-aligned. It kind of became clear that wasn't going to be good enough. That he was going to have to focus on the international system. Okay, so on the right here, this is my measure of India's defense imports. So I've got arms imports. I'm using what is called a spider graph or a radar graph to kind of show that there are, the different possibilities of how you could sort of align, right? Of course, in this first period, this is a little bit misleading because one, India is not arming to the degree that it does later in these early years, and its system is mostly kind of a legacy of being part of British India. So it's pretty tight. It gets most of its arms from the UK. It's starting to get some more from France. But that's really where it's kind of focused at. So it's sort of non-aligned in the sense that it doesn't do very much what the UK wants, even though it gets most of its weapons from the UK. And it's trying to stay out of great power politics. After the 1962 China-India War, we see a different view from India. They start to, right, so for one, the China-India War, it happens during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right where the Soviet Union and the US are sort of facing off in this high-stakes nuclear brinkmanship. And India finds itself in this tough situation where it can't defend itself along the border as well as it needs to, especially up in the mountains. And so it asks the USSR and the US and UK for aid. The US and the UK actually give them aid. And it's significant, but not like, probably game-changing. The USSR stays on its China alignment and doesn't aid India in this process. Nonetheless, over time, during this period, India starts to, what I'm calling shallow alignment, starting to move a little closer toward the USSR. And that doesn't happen just because of the China War. In fact, it happens in spite of the China War. The China War is what kind of convinced India that it's going to need to arm itself to protect itself, especially after the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War. Over time, this starts to become clearer and clearer that they're going to start going closer to the Soviet Union. For one, they thought Soviet equipment was good equipment, so they thought that was a good plan. Again, U.S. relationship with Pakistan is a little bit off and on, but they don't like the U.S. arming Pakistan, which they're afraid that those weapons are going to get used against them. So it's hard to be friends with both. That's a lesson that will come through a lot. The Johnson administration tries to do neutrality, tries to court both India and Pakistan, and that is difficult and kind of pushes both sides, I think, to both Pakistan to China and India to the USSR. Nixon, on the other hand, takes a stronger stance in favor of Pakistan, and that shows up mostly in the 1971 war, which will show up on our next thing, but our next slide. But a lot of this is basically what it do is pushing India a little bit more toward making a choice between the Soviet Union and the USSR, or sorry, the Soviet Union and the US. There's some ideological reasons why they might go together a little bit better. They shared some anti-imperialism, planned economies, even some anti-capitalist views. And then, of course, the emerging Sino-Soviet split, which is really going on for a while, but really shows up a lot in this border clash. Excuse my typo there. It's a 1969 border clash between the Chinese and the Soviets. And so that allows India to go a little bit harder toward the Soviet Union. And you can see that it's starting to do that, but it's sort of still shallow. It's still a little bit in both ways, a little bit UK, a little bit USSR, and it's just starting to move in that direction. It becomes deeply aligned with the Soviet Union, maybe not to the extent of a full military alliance, the way that we often think of like deep alignment or some of these situations. But the Sino-Soviet split furthers, it breaks. It becomes clear that, I mean, basically that split is what allows India to really go all in on the Soviet Union and really become deeply aligned. If it wasn't for that Sino-Soviet split, India would have a much more difficult time trying to choose between these options. But with China and the Soviet Union splitting and not working together anymore, now they can believe that the Soviet Union will support them when they need support, as opposed to what they didn't get in 1962. They didn't get that Soviet support, but now they're going to get that support because China and the Soviets are split. And this results in a number of things, right? The 1971 Treaty of Friendship between the India and the Soviet Union. Of course, we have the 1971 war in East Pakistan and later Bangladesh and the Indo-Pac war there. Again, U.S. Takes Pakistan's side and really sort of subtly threatens India in this process by moving the 7th Fleet over to the Bay of Bengal, whereas the Soviet Union takes a stronger side on top of for India. In 1972, Nixon goes to China and really kind of cements this split publicly. And then India has to fear the US, Pakistan, China axis, these three countries all getting along too well in their point of view. And so it needs to counterbalance that out. And so it makes sense for it to sort of deeply align with the Soviet Union. This changes a little bit, but not significantly. And this is more of an implication of it in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 and through the '80s. One thing, this adds way more aid and relationship to Pakistan from the United States. And it demonstrates that India, even though it's shocked by this, that the Soviets would do something in their neighborhood in South Asia, really without warning them or asking their permission. But it's because of this alignment and its dependence, they really can't. They can't object to it too much publicly, at least. And so here's our view of the imports from this point of view, and it's much deeper. It's pushing really strongly toward just being USSR. They've broken from most things with the UK, and they're become highly dependent on the USSR. Of course, defense. So, oops. Okay, so 1992 to 2004, I think this is a period where we go back to sort of a shallow alignment. The USSR is broken down or broken apart. The successor state Russia is not nearly as strong. It's kind of in disarray and kind of confused about what it's going to do for a while. It starts to kind of, first détente and then rapprochement with the West, and then, where does India fit into all of that? For a decent amount of this time through the 90s, you get the U.S. and Russia kind of neglecting South Asia, at least in my point of view. Because the Soviets are out of Afghanistan, the relationship with Pakistan kind of goes back to neglect, and India and Pakistan are just not on the radars really until the nuclear tests in '98. There were some efforts to get them to not test and to get both sides to not pursue this, and along with the non-proliferation regime of the Clinton administration, but obviously that didn't work. The U.S. sanctions both countries after the nuclear tests, and then of course you've got the Kargil War that we're all familiar with, and where the U.S. has kind of a diplomatic interjection at the end of that conflict, in part to give Pakistan a way out of it, I think, but also it kind of comes out in favor of India's information campaign, India's story, and that comes out in favor of India on that. So as you'll see here, because that relationship was deeply aligned before, and defense imports are sticky, right? You can't just change your systems overnight. You still see this really strong Russia component to their arms imports. They're arming themselves a lot. They've got India has a lot of internal security problems. They've still got these border issues, but they're still dependent on Russia for that. Russia still has maintains its arms industry, as India is trying to build its own, but sort of not getting there to the degree that it needs to. And then we get to kind of the current period, which is kind of a gradual increase of U.S. friendly ties, of what I'm calling multi-alignment. So the U.S. or India is still tied to Russia, especially for defense. Those things, again, are really hard to change, but it starts to move. It starts to move back toward the U.S. And there's other things that are going on here. There's worries about the U.S. support to Pakistan, especially defense exports like the F-16s, that really upsets the defense industry and the strategic community in India. But really, from the civilian nuclear deal on, we just can kind of see this gradual improvement in U.S. ties. So much so that by the time you get to 2020, after the China Galwan Valley clash and the active territorial dispute in the Himalayas, you get a lot more U.S. Support for India. India is asking for more. Of course, they're still tied to Russia. They've got the S-14s coming. They've got these other things, but they're trying to play both sides a little bit. Like I said, India maintains its ties to Russia, Iran. These are things that the U.S. doesn't want to see, but is sort of willing to take a bet on. India also expands to other countries, especially defense ties to Israel, France, Australia, and really that continues. So it's much more of a multi-aligned policy as opposed to just trying to do one or the other. And like I said, what is going to come to the conclusion here is that this is going to create some tension, I think, in this relationship with the U.S. Over the long run, in part because of these geopolitical responses, but also because of the different expectations each country has on what this means for their relationship. So I've got a couple slides here with some tentative conclusions, and then we'll turn it over to questions. So the first one, in regard to the models, is that it's very difficult to explain India's foreign policy behavior with a singular approach. India emerges from independence with this non-aligned preference and tries really hard to enact it. And you can't explain that just from its geopolitical situation. That really does come, I think, from these internal, it comes from, in my view, it comes from the Indian National Congress and its sort of view on things, and its preference for anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and it manifests itself in different ways. Gandhi's view is very different than Nehru's view of how to become independent and self-sufficient. But I believe that non-alignment preference comes from that. However, and you can see from what I was talking through, or hopefully that's evident, is that India's behavior changes based on the geopolitical context. And you can't really explain all of that with strategic culture because it changes much more on context than it does on which party is in power, on which philosophical leanings different leaders have, things like that. And you'll notice that it does change, but with my main measure of that with defense ties is not perfect. It doesn't perfectly align with this narrative approach that I've got, in part because defense ties and systems are sticky. Once you've gone all in on one country's defense system, it's really hard to break that, and you probably can't break it quickly, and you probably can't break it all the systems all at once. That would just be too expensive. Okay, so now what does all of this mean for the U.S. bet on India? Well, if you're the U.S. policymakers, there's some good news here. The good news is that India's strategic culture of non-alignment, strategic autonomy, probably won't stop it from aligning with the United States. That's probably clear now. When I first started writing this, it wasn't, but taking my time here, I guess. So, but in the past, India has aligned based on geopolitical conditions, and it's trying to protect that autonomy, but it really is forced to respond to geopolitics and really be an active player in geopolitics. And because those conditions favor aligning with the U.S., this is good news for the U.S. at this point. increased Chinese power and their threatening actions, especially on the line of actual control. But elsewhere, I think have convinced India that they're probably going to need some more help because Russia and China now, especially after the Ukraine war, are becoming closer and closer together. That also means that they can't rely on the Russian equipment to be forthcoming if they do get in a war with China. So the end of the Sino-Soviet split, now we've got Russia and China coming back together again, or at least a little bit. And that's a worrying thing for India. So it has to find an alternative mechanisms. But of course, it doesn't want to replace Russian dependency with U.S. dependency. So it's kind of multi-layered. It's getting a lot from Israel, a lot from France, that sort of thing. And of course, the end of the U.S. in Afghanistan de-emphasizes Pakistan in U.S. strategy. At least, again, this is my point of view. I haven't seen this in any documents, but basically that situation allows India to believe that the U.S. is not going to arm Pakistan against India in the future because it doesn't need Pakistan as much. Now, I don't know that that's the case, and I don't know that that's, there's still a deep relationship with the U.S. and Pakistan. But you can see how that sort of takes away the pragmatic need to do so. Some bad news for the U.S. On the bet on India, right? So India's ideological preference for autonomy is very strong. And this means that it's much more likely that they're going to prefer a multi-alignment posture than a deep alignment with the United States. So the U.S. probably should not expect that India is going to become a strong alliance partner. And when you talk to them, they know this. They don't say the word alliance around India. They don't say those things. They know better. But nonetheless, it's going to create some friction in this relationship. India sees its multi-alignment and its path to a multipolar world rather than being in just a U.S. bloc. And again, like I said, this doesn't match U.S. expectations or sort of our internal strategic thinking. And that's going to make it a difficult relationship. And we see this a lot with India's muted response to the war in Ukraine. That was big news for a while. So why aren't you condemning this? This is obviously wrong. Well, and India isn't going to do that. We have the U.S. runs FONAPs, Freedom of Navigation apps, against India, and everyone freaks out. I thought we were friends. Why are we doing this? F-16s to Pakistan. There's more. So there's a lot of difficultness in this relationship. And I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to skip my other points, but my other slides that are kind of getting at this. But the other thing that's going to be different in this coming period is that there's a lot of cross-cutting alignments. I'm just going to leave this up and not talk through it all. But basically, there's not bloc politics in the Indo-Pacific. There are lots of countries that are trying to align with different countries at the same time, and those countries are adversaries. And that makes bloc politics very difficult. It means that you're going to have to fight against your instincts to break up other alignments. And in particular, the U.S. is really expecting India to disalign with Russia, and I don't see that happening very quickly. And that's going to just create some issues for a long time. So that's it. I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I'm going to turn it over to questions. And thank you for listening to me. And I'm sorry I probably put you to sleep. I know it's getting to be bedtime over there in Karachi. So thanks again for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, we are very thankful to you, Dr. Philip, for delivering a very comprehensive, a very insightful talk on India's geostrategic importance as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. So now we would take some questions. If anyone you would like to ask a question, you may ask, please. Yes. Any question?
Yes, sir. May I?
Yes, please.
First of all, yes, sir. First of all, I am very much thankful to Dr. Arif Khan, and thank you, sir, for joining us here, for being there. My question is that, sir, as India has the extensive coastline of approximately 7,516 kilometers, India's maritime boundaries provide access to numerous ports and play a crucial role in its trade and strategic interests. By keeping in view all these aspects, what challenges can India face in its efforts to strengthen its maritime security and economic ties in the Indo-Pacific? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, this is a great question. So you're right. I mean, India has strong geographic reasons to be a maritime power, but for historical reasons, it's been focused on the continent. And now that doesn't mean that you can't really do one or the other, or that you can't be both, right? So, but it's difficult because you have to choose where your dollars are going to go, and then you've got to work through the bureaucracy to get that to happen. So, if you're going to reinvest in the maritime domain, which is happening, it's very difficult for India to do that when the army is the strongest bureaucratic service in the services, and the army has a very important role. Right, it has a very serious situation on both of its northern and northwestern borders. Right, it has these territorial disputes that it has to take seriously. So it's very hard to invest that money out of the army and into the navy while those things are happening at the same time, and especially with an ongoing dispute and an ongoing standoff, in the Himalayas with China. So the question for the U.S. is, if the U.S. wants India to play this role, I mean, all of this is about whether or not, because it knows that it's not going to be able to get India to just do what it wants, like it does with a lot of countries, and just make them part of it. So the U.S. is, during the Cold War and after, is just sort of bring countries under its security and say, okay, we'll take care of that for you. You don't have to worry about that. For one, India won't accept that. That would make them a junior partner, and that would make it very difficult. That would go against the culture of strategic autonomy. And two, the U.S. is more constrained now, right? We're becoming a multipolar world, and the U.S. can't manage every part of the globe on its own. So it wants India to do this, but India's going to have a very hard time doing it. So what can it do? I think what it can do is basically try to do joint patrolling. You could exchange basically port calls, or sort of with different ports in. This actually comes from an article that Arizan Tapur wrote in Foreign Affairs recently. He was saying that the U.S., Australia, and India can really do a lot together just by exchanging Navy port calls in their respective ports in the south, or the eastern side of the Indian Ocean in particular, in Moderator. But really, the U.S. is going to have to invest a lot in India's defense naval capabilities, I think, if it really wants India to do that. And that's difficult, because when the more you invest in somebody else to do that, the U.S. also has an arms industry that it wants to keep thriving. It doesn't want to give away all of its technology. Those are very important things for the U.S. So it's a dilemma. Basically try to build up port infrastructure, try to build up more ships, and then have relationships with these other countries to exchange, and try to patrol more. Basically show ports that you've got, it kind of put something physical on the ground, or really on the ground, in the water, to the relationship, and especially for the Quad relationship. I hope that answers it somewhat. I don't know how to do it deeply, I guess.
Okay. Thank you for your answer, Dr. Philip. Now we have another participant who would like to ask a question. Faisal Sadiq, please. Can you hear me, Faisal Sadiq?
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Sir, I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
you are.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. It was a great presentation. But my question is not with respect to India. My question is with respect to the country, which is, Pakistan at the crossroads. We don't have Kotalia, we don't have Clausewitz, we don't have Sun Tzu. What we have are the problems and the alignment which we had in the past, and I think we are paying because of that. We can't import oil from our Western neighbor, and we are in a fix. And what to do with the model which we have made. If we put Pakistan in that model, then how you see we can be we can have this multi-alignment in your, as per your study, as per your research. So how do you see that? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, you know, of any of these 5 countries that I've highlighted, that I think the alignments shift as they all react to each other. I think you could do a study where you focused in on either one. Because I've done more work on in India, I kind of focused on that one, and because it has direct implications for the U.S. But the Pakistan relationship is similar, right? It's in the sense of you could do a similar study on Pakistan to see how it shifts. Does it shift in the same way based on domestic, you know, who's in power or these geopolitical conditions? You know, your question about what Pakistan should do, I'm afraid I won't be able to help you with that too much, but because I think you're right. I mean, Pakistan is in a tough spot in terms of its position. You know, one of the things that is left off of this talk is you know, what each side has learned from the other's behavior, right? So one of the things that India, I think, has learned, right? So the U.S. is always trying to push India and other countries to have what we say a values-based relationship as opposed to a transactional relationship. But what India has learned by watching the U.S. relationship with Pakistan over the last, you know, 50, 70 years has been a much more transactional relationship. And I'm not saying that to, that's just my academic opinion, not a slight on U.S. or Pakistani policy. It's just that U.S. and Pakistan relations kind of ebb and flow based on those conditions and how much the U.S. needs Pakistan. You know, so in the early years, it needed it for the anti-communist point of view, right? And then during the 80s in Afghanistan, and again in 2001 with Afghanistan. So for one, that hurts the U.S. abroad, in my view, because it makes the U.S. look more transactional than it would like to be. But it's also taught, I think, Pakistan that that it's difficult, right? That all of these relationships are transactional, right? So in my view, Pakistan is pursuing a multi-alignment strategy, right? It still wants to have those connections to the United States, but it's increasingly closer with China. It's been close to China for a long time, but I feel like it's closer now. We've got the CPAC and other things like that. And I think over time, there will be pressures that will try to split those, right? So the U.S. will either try to split Pakistan and China, or cut Pakistan loose, you know, and it might have to choose India or Pakistan. It's hard to do this cross-cutting alignments. If everyone does multi-alignment, it makes for very difficult politics. It just makes it harder. It's not impossible, and we might be stuck with that because it's more of a multipolar world than it was during the Cold War. But most people in the United States, I think, are more used to thinking about things in terms of bloc politics rather than this multi-alignment and cross-cutting alignments, which is much more complex.
Okay, so we have another participant, Nuzhat Tariq. She has raised her hand. Nuzhat, can you hear me, please? Please ask the question.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Hello,
You
sir.
are.
First of all, okay, sir. Hello, sir. First of all, really glad to be a part of this wonderful webinar. Sir, my question is regarding the current scenarios, the recent G20 summit, which took place at Delhi. India and USA have considered it to be a successful summit. But one thing which we all have noticed that Xi Jinping was not there. So then there was a lot of speculations of Jinping snubbed the summit. So in your opinion, what do you think about it? That by vacating China, Xi Jinping, by vacating their presence, what China missed and what India and US has gained? And does China really lost its clout and let India propagate its great area?
You broke up a little at the end, but I think I follow in your question. Yeah, this is a great question because, you know, so the politics of summits are in many ways kind of their own thing. They're a way to demonstrate right? For India in particular, is a way to demonstrate its leadership of the G20, and it can claim a handful of victories there in terms of achieving getting the African Union. It's trying to make a play for speaking a little bit for the developing world. It's trying to make a play for being a great power, for being one of the poles in a multipolar system. With Xi Jinping not showing up, this is a kind of a classic diplomatic dilemma that they are in. If Xi Jinping shows up and gives credibility to that, it might make India look stronger. But by not showing up, it also takes them out of the game, and it allows India to basically get a win. It would be harder if they were there. And we noticed the same thing, right? With Putin didn't show up, but the Foreign Secretary Lavrov did. But even then, that sort of slowed down the U.S. Right? Normally, you take a lot of pictures and you do all these kinds of other things, but the U.S. doesn't really want to be in the shot with the Foreign Secretary of Russia right now. So the politics of these summits can be interesting. I think of them mostly as kind of a snapshot of relationships. I don't think they change these trajectories in huge ways. They kind of reflect the status of things now. I do think it demonstrates some of this difficulty of India is in and the U.S. is in, of trying to have these cross-cutting alignments. For Xi Jinping, I think that I think it's common. It's a tough trade-off to choose, but in some cases, it's better to choose the one where you might not get as much out of you want, but you don't show, you demonstrate your dissatisfaction, and you can kind of maintain some pride that way, as opposed to going there and it not working out with you having to stand there, right? So I can't remember where I heard this, but somebody said, well, could you imagine if Xi Jinping was standing there in the corner while President Biden and Prime Minister Modi were discussing their other, this corridor that was really going to challenge this European Middle Eastern corridor that was really going to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative or something. That would just be an awkward situation to be in.
Okay, any other question which any student want to ask, please? We can take the last question, please. Any question?
Yes, sir. I have a question.
Okay. Samad.
Okay. As we are
Yusuf Sheikh, he wants Abdul Samad Yusuf Sheikh, he wants to ask a question. Can you see Philip? He wrote in the chat. Yusuf Sheikh.
Oh, let me pull it up.
Can you please? Yes. You just please explain it precisely, very brief, and then we will take the last question from from Abdul Samad, please.
I'm not seeing the question in the chat. Was there one that I'm missing?
Okay. Okay, I'm just sending you on your WhatsApp. I am sending you on your WhatsApp. You open your WhatsApp, Dr. Philip? Yes, here you are.
It just pops up. Okay, so it says, in your opinion, after being a part of India, Middle East, European economic corridor, are they partners would be successful to compel India to impose a big cut in arms imports from Russia in light of the Ukraine issue? Yes, so I think that the U.S. was very eager to see India reduce its arms imports from Russia. And India is going to want to do the same, even if it's not a full disalignment from Russia. I think it's likely that India is going to want to get its weapons from multiple sources until it can build up its own indigenous arms manufacturing capacity, which takes a long time. Can you imagine, to kind of replace all of Russian? But the more that Russia and China are aligned, the more difficulty India will have in believing that Russia will resupply India with parts whenever if it ever does fight more directly with China. The Ukraine war has added a new urgency to that problem because Russia is using up its own arms at a high rate, right? And so how much does it even have to sell, to give in this scenario? So either way, in both of those scenarios, either one of those scenarios were true, India would have a strong reason to reduce its dependence on Russia. But it still can't do it quickly. It still can't do it fast because all of these legacy systems are Russian systems. And the U.S. is not filling the entire void there, right? They're also reaching out to Israel and France, so they're trying to take from multi sources and build their own. So that's kind of what I think in terms of, I think that's what they want to do. I think it's difficult to do. It's going to be slow, and that's going to mean that they're going to stay somewhat aligned, or at least not clearly disaligned with Russia for a very long time. If that's
Okay, Dr. Philip, if you permit, there is a request of 2 questions more. If you permit, can they ask?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Nuzat, Samad, first of all, Samad. Very precisely, better, very precisely.
Okay, sir. As some scholars think that internally disturbed Pakistan is a serious concern for India's growth in international arena. Since the withdrawal of America from Afghanistan, the TTP has emerged as a serious concern for internal stability of Pakistan. So, what do you think in this scenario? That what implications can India take from that?
Yeah, I mean, so the U.S. wants to stay. The U.S. would like to be friendly with both, right? So the U.S. With India and Pakistan, but the sort of geopolitical circumstances kind of dictate which one it's going to lean to in either one point in time. Because the more that you arm one against the other, the more you're going to fracture that relationship. So it's very difficult to do both at the same time. However, the U.S. has tried really hard to sort of, they call it de-hyphenization, meaning that instead of talking about it as the India-Pakistan problem together, they try to say, okay, well, this is how we're going to deal with Pakistan, this is how we're going to deal with India. And that helps bureaucratically get some things going. And it allows them to continue to work with Pakistan. The U.S. has a really strong interest in Pakistani's stability and security. And like you said, because of some of these things, there's a challenge, especially up there near the borders. There's issues. It's a very difficult problem to solve. I don't know that the U.S. has. I mean, I haven't talked to anybody working on this problem specifically, but I don't know if anybody has a good solution to it, except that the U.S. wants to maintain good relationships. They want stability. They want to make sure that the army and the nuclear arsenal don't get compromised by some of the internal instability. And really, you asked what the implications are for India. I mean, I think both countries would be better off if they took a view that the other side being more stable was better than the other side being more internally conflicted or having insurgency. So I think I wish India took the view that Pakistani stability was more important. I don't really know exactly how it comes down on that. I haven't talked to people about that issue or read specifically, but it's very common to want your adversaries, the people that are bothering you, right? So that India notices, right? India ascribes all of the cross-border issues to Pakistan. And it sees Pakistan interfering in its domestic politics and causing instability. But really, it would be much better if both sides took a view of stability over just trying to hurt your adversary. Right? You want to build yourself into a long-term solution, and that's very difficult to do at the status that it's been for so long.
Okay, Nuzat Tariq. Nuzat, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Sir, as you highlighted about the alignment and non-alignment, in other words, when we dissect these two words, it's about morality and neutrality. And for some countries who opt alignment, it would be to escape the identity crisis and to serve their geopolitical insecurities. And for according to some scholars, in Cold War era, it was much easier to be in alignment and non-alignment. But in today's situation, it's far impossible, like to sustain independent foreign policy and to be in neutral position and to be in non-alignment position. So, sir, what do you think that non-alignment and neutrality is still prevalent in today's multipolar world?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really, like you said, it's very difficult to be non-aligned as long as you have these major security challenges. So, you know, as India, there's kind of a paradox in it because, you know, as India has become more powerful, I mean, it was much less powerful in the 50s when it was able to be, in my view, relatively non-aligned. It was able to pursue a moralistic foreign policy. It was able to sort of say, to denounce the United States or to denounce the Soviet Union and their politics and their nuclear policies. And they didn't have very much power. They were struggling compared to what their power is now, which is much stronger. But at the same time, as your power grows, your interest tends to grow with that. And so now they've got interests outside of the subcontinent, and with China's belligerence on the border, right, making that a hot border clash as opposed to a one that was being negotiated. That makes it very difficult for India to stay insular. They need, even though they've got more power, that power has come from a lot of internal sources, which are good for them. They've got a lot of internal ingredients of power, but they're still relying on external sources. So it's very difficult to stay non-aligned just from a pragmatic point of view. From India's perspective, you could imagine a scenario where they were able to grow indigenously their own power, their own weapon systems, and then you would be able to see a little bit more, be kind of a stronger test of these two theories. Would India say, okay, now we've got this power on our own, and we're going to close ourselves off. We're going to say, stay out of the Himalayas, and we're going to deal with our borders, and we're going to manage the sea, and then we're going to leave the rest of the world on its own, right? That could be a way to do non-alignment. Or they could do non-alignment by being one of the poles in a multipolar world, where they take an active role in global politics, but they kind of, but not a strong, military, or not a direct alignment with one of the other great powers, but to really hold off their own sphere. And I suspect that's probably more like where India would like to go. But if it had the ability, then you would really be able to tell if it wanted to be non-aligned or how autonomous it wanted to be. But I think as its power has grown, its ambitions are going to grow with that, and you'll see it wanting to take stronger stances on things further and further away.
Okay, we also have some other questions. If time permits you, we can take there are two more questions. If you have time, so we can take it.
Okay,
Can we?
Go ahead. I see a couple in the chat. Is that the ones?
In the age of rise of new mercantilism, what is your study highlights Indian foreign policy and in the context of Quad and BRICS?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I was reading the other one and I didn't listen very well. Okay, can you repeat that question?
Okay, how is India's relationship with its neighbors in the Indian Ocean region, such as Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, impacting its geostrategic relation in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very, there's another thing is one of the reasons for one of the dilemmas I mentioned at the beginning is that India's global image is actually pretty different than its regional image. And sometimes that comes along with, right, your neighbors for a very long time. And so a lot of the neighbors have even when they have good relationships, they've got historical reasons to be skeptical of Indian power and Indian influence. So without specifically talking about, the details of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, I'm a little bit more familiar with like Nepal and some of the Himalayan ones. But the, part of the issue with India's regional ambitions is that it inherited the British security dynamic, which was right to have buffer states. Right, the British India was secure because it had buffer states and it had mountains that secured basically most of the way all the way around it. And so British India was pretty secure. It still had to worry a lot about stuff coming through Afghanistan, and it had the great game with Russia. But at partition, that kind of broke that system, right? So now you still had buffer states in the Northeast and the Himalayas. You had Nepal, Sikkim, Tibet, Bhutan, and they were supposed to buffer away China. The Afghani buffer state becomes less important, or is still important, but because of partition, India now has an adversary inside its circle and has two adversaries, or that adversary Pakistan, or West Pakistan and East Pakistan. So now India's security situation is different there. Over time, it sort of inherited this belief that it was going to be the regional hegemon of the area. It does have more material power than most of the other countries, but it's never been able to secure that, in a specific way. I have a different paper with Prakash Adhikari on India's regional hegemonic behavior, and it kind of tells a little bit of this story, and looks at different versions of what kind of hegemon would India try to be. One is to try to dominate the region. One is to kind of lead the region in sort of regional integration, and another one is to kind of create a sphere of influence, an economic sphere of influence. And India has kind of tried to do each of them. More recently, it's tried to do the leadership one, but it's been slow to take hold because of the history, right? So I think about its relationship with Nepal. It was a very dependent relationship, right? It has an open border, but India has not been hesitant to use its position to try to get what it wants out of Nepal. And Nepalis resent that, like anybody would, just like India resents it when someone else tries to get them to do something, or just like, every person in the world does this. So it's a normal thing. But that makes regional integration, that makes leading the region difficult. And so I think it's doing better in some areas, in Sri Lanka more recently. But other countries, and I think in general with Bangladesh, has been pretty favorable, not without its issues. But there's other countries that are really that are kind of on the fence now that China has increased its influence in the South Asia. So Nepal can always kind of play the China card and kind of go back and forth between India and China. The Maldives, right, takes a lot of investment from China, but also from India, and there's this middle of the ground approach. So India's had a hard time consolidating its regional hegemony like it would like to, and of course, it's not going to happen with Pakistan because of the rivalry. But I think that's holding it back, but it really creates a dilemma for the United States too, that India wants to consolidate its position as a hegemon, but it's difficult to do that in places that are kind of mistrustful of India sometimes. But the U.S., so the U.S. might try to go outside of that and try to, build up relationships with Nepal and things outside of that relationship. And that's kind of where it's been going. It's called the Millennium, what's it called? MCC. Can't remember, but it's a Millennium Challenge Corporation, I think, or something like that. But it's a development. It's sort of seen as a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative and the Chinese investment in some of these places. But it's not. It's hard to match. It's hard to match the Belt and Road investments. So sorry, I didn't answer your question very well about Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, but I don't know the specifics very well.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Dr. Philip, for your very elaborative talk. We are looking forward for having you again in the future, and we will be glad to welcome you in Karachi for a conference or any other academic activity in the Karachi in Pakistan here.
Yes, I would love to go, and I can practice my very poor Urdu. So I really appreciate the.
Okay, so so you know Urdu, right?
No, not well enough.
A little bit.
Toda.
Okay. So bundle of thanks for your time, for your precious time that you have spared time for us, and hope to see you again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to you all, and I'm sure you can all sleep well tonight after that talk. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.